Trump's trade war just got personal, and it's blowing up in his face spectacularly. While the world watches the International Criminal Court under assault, Canada just delivered a masterclass in how to stand up to American bullying. We're talking about Canada's formal recognition of Palestine despite Trump's furious threats to derail trade deals. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. Canada is staying silent while one of its own judges faces U.S. sanctions. This isn't just about trade or foreign policy, it's about whether America can still strong-arm its allies into submission. So what exactly is happening behind closed doors? And why is Canada playing a dangerous game of diplomatic chess with the most powerful man in the world? To understand this story, we need to rewind to July 30th, 2025, when Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney made an announcement that would send shockwaves through Washington. Canada intends to recognize the State of Palestine at the 81st session of the United Nations General Assembly in September, if certain conditions are met. This wasn't just another diplomatic gesture. For decades, Canada had been a staunch supporter of Israel, publicly refusing to recognize Palestine as recently as 2014 under Stephen Harper's Conservative government. The shift represented a fundamental change in Canadian foreign policy, one that would put Ottawa on a direct collision course with Trump's America. Carney's announcement came with specific conditions that revealed the complexity of Canada's position. The Palestinian Authority would have to hold general elections in 2026, in which Hamas can play no part, and commit to demilitarizing the Palestinian state. These weren't empty demands. They were carefully crafted requirements designed to address legitimate security concerns while still advancing Palestinian statehood. But Trump's reaction was swift and predictable. Within hours of Carney's announcement, the former president took to his Truth social platform with a message that would define the next phase of U.S.-Canada relations. Wow, Canada has just announced that it is backing statehood for Palestine. That will make it very hard for us to make a trade deal with them. Oh, Canada, the timing couldn't have been more strategic or more threatening. Trump had set an August 1st deadline for countries to reach trade deals with the United States, or face a crushing 35% tariff on goods not covered by existing agreements. Canada was already in intense negotiations to avoid these punitive measures, and suddenly Trump had new leverage. While Trump was making these threats, he was simultaneously floating an even more outrageous proposition.
They called me a couple of weeks ago. They want to be part of it. To which I said, well, why don't you just join our country? You become 51, become the 51st state.
Let's now bring in Peter MacKay, former Conservative Foreign Affairs Minister, in this conversation. Sir, good morning and thank you for your time.
Good morning, Akshay. Good to be with you.
Let's make a start with your reaction to this news that's just come in. Prime Minister Carney visiting Donald Trump for the second time in few months.
Well, I think it's always positive to engage. Difficult, of course, in the best of circumstances. And as we've seen previously, going to the White House, no matter who you are, there's very much a sense of volatility and what mood will the Prime Minister and the President be in on that particular day. Prime Minister Carney has a big agenda item, and that is to get back to somehow normalizing relations around trade and talking about how we ensure the continuation of the USMCA. But as that clip just demonstrates, as long as this continued reference to the 51st state remains foremost in the President's mind, this is not an atmosphere that is going to make these type of negotiations easy, and it's something that absolutely enrages Canadians and isn't going to happen, by the way, Akshay.
True that, sir.
During discussions about missile defense cooperation, Trump had suggested to Canadian officials that Canada should simply become the 51st state of America. The comment, though delivered with Trump's characteristic blend of humor and menace, revealed his fundamental view of the relationship. Canada existed as an independent nation only at America's pleasure. This wasn't just about economics. Trump was using trade as a weapon to coerce countries on unrelated foreign policy issues, a tactic that would become increasingly common in his second term. The message was clear: fall in line with American foreign policy or pay the economic price. The economic impact was already devastating, with 86,000 Canadian jobs lost in just 2 months.
Months now with little visible signs of progress, and conservatives say they're sick of the prime minister going abroad.
He's elbows up, elbows down, he's flying all around, and it's cost 86,000 Canadians their jobs. Everywhere he goes, things get worse. When will the prime minister just stop? Park the jet before he costs more Canadians jobs.
We've signed landmark agreements in Europe. We've signed landmark agreements in Asia. We've gone to Mexico, signed landmark agreements with the administration there. This prime minister is active. He's out there building export markets. He's out there building opportunities for.
Conservative critics were hammering Carney's government over the trade war's toll on Canadian workers, even as the Prime Minister defended his strategy of signing landmark agreements with other nations to reduce dependence on the United States. Former Ambassador Frank McKenna revealed that while most products crossing the border faced relatively low tariffs, strategic sectors like steel and aluminum were being hit by the punitive 50% rates.
Well, if it's true, it certainly represents a breakthrough. You have to remember in context that we have the lowest tariff rates in the world at about 5%. That's because most of the products which cross the border are CUSMA compliant. The problem is that there are some exceptions which the United States have carved out that are at 50%, and that includes steel and aluminum. And for those particular industries, they're being really hard done by. But we have reason to believe that the United States is suffering as well from the steel and aluminum tariffs. In the case of aluminum, probably close to 75% of the aluminum used in the United States comes from Canada, which is really accelerating the cost for a lot of commodities within the United States and putting pressure on the government to find a compromise. So it wouldn't be surprised if there was some movement on those two commodities.
These tariffs, absurdly justified as addressing national security threats, were driving up costs for American consumers even as they devastated Canadian industries. McKenna noted that approximately 75% of aluminum used in the United States came from Canada, creating pressure on both sides for a resolution. What made Canada's position even more remarkable was the context in which it occurred. The country was following similar moves by France and the United Kingdom, creating a coordinated international effort to preserve the possibility of a two-state solution. France had become the first G7 nation to announce Palestinian recognition, with President Emmanuel Macron saying his country would formally recognize a Palestinian state during the same UN meeting. The UK followed with its own conditional recognition, though Prime Minister Keir Starmer said Britain's recognition would come unless Israel takes substantive steps to end the appalling situation in Gaza. This wasn't happening in a vacuum. The humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza had reached unprecedented levels, with Palestinian health officials reporting more than 60,000 deaths since October 2023, including thousands of children. The UN was warning of mounting evidence of famine and widespread starvation, while aid distribution sites were being targeted with deadly consequences. For Canada, the decision to recognize Palestine represented a fundamental shift from its traditional approach of waiting for a negotiated settlement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Carney explicitly acknowledged this change, stating that the reality on the ground, including Israel's allowing starvation to unfold in Gaza, meant the prospect of a Palestinian state is literally receding before our eyes. The government was trying to balance multiple pressures simultaneously. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand outlined Canada's strategy for economic resilience, emphasizing that the country had free trade agreements with every other G7 nation.
Any particular tariff measure that the United States is adopting, we are, of course, working for the benefit of the Canadian economy. One of the points in the speech that I made at the UN General Assembly today is, in fact, about our economic resilience at home. Canada is doubling down on our multilateral relationships, not only in defense and security, but also in areas of the economy, such as the WTO. We are forging new economic partnerships with partners. I cited the trade agreement with Indonesia last week, Mexico, and further efforts in the EU, for example. So this is all hands on deck for Canada in terms of defense and security, in terms of economic resilience, as well as, of course, standing up for our core values.
Let me drill down on that, because that's sort of a focus of the speech that you delivered, right? Here are the three planks of our foreign policy as we put it forth. Defense and security, as you mentioned, the second, economic resilience, and the third, core values. I want to pick up on the economic resilience part, because you gave some examples in Mexico, Indonesia, and in Europe. Your opposition at this moment in time says that you're essentially conveying something that isn't true. That in Indonesia's case, for example, that deal was actually arrived at in November of 2024, before this prime minister took office. That in Mexico, there's not anything really tangible besides an agreement saying that you want to work together more. That even in Europe, CETA is largely in place, and that there's no sort of proof of what those expanded relationships will actually mean for Canadians. Can you respond to that criticism that basically you're advertising something that isn't fully?
She discussed recent trade deals with Indonesia and Mexico and ongoing efforts with the European Union, positioning these as part of Canada's strategy to reduce dependence on the U.S. market while strengthening multilateral relationships. But critics pointed out that despite multiple free trade agreements signed over the past decade, 75 to 80% of Canada's exports still went to the United States. The reality of geographic proximity and economic integration couldn't be overcome by diplomatic agreements with distant nations. The government announced a $400 million relief loan for tariff-hit Algoma steel, with Ontario adding another $100 million.
Jobs Minister Patty Hajdu there announcing a $400 million relief loan for tariff-hit Algoma steel. The Ontario government adding another $100 million for the Sault Ste. Marie company. The demand from sectors hit by Trump's tariffs is one of the reasons the Fed say their November budget will have a, quote, substantial deficit. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is not buying what they're selling. Take a listen.
Recently, Mr. Carney appointed a parliamentary budget officer, and that budget officer is commenting on Carney's spending and his deficits and said they are, quote, very alarming, stupefying, shocking, unsustainable. If you don't change, this is done. The 5-year horizon for deficits has now doubled under Carney versus what it was under Trudeau. So a more conservative-looking haircut, suit, and resume has not resulted in more conservative spending.
The federal government indicated their November budget would have a substantial deficit due to sectors affected by Trump's tariffs, drawing fierce criticism from conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, who cited the parliamentary budget officer's description of the deficits as very alarming, stupefying, shocking, and unsustainable. But here's where the story takes a darker turn, one that reveals the true extent of America's campaign against international justice. While Canada was taking a principled stand on Palestinian statehood, it was remaining conspicuously silent on an equally important issue, the U.S. assault on the International Criminal Court. The ICC had become a target of unprecedented American aggression under Trump's second term. The court had issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza. It was also investigating possible war crimes by U.S. forces in Afghanistan, though it had already indicated it would prioritize abuses by the Taliban and ISIS after fierce American pushback. Trump's response was to launch a systematic campaign to destroy the court's ability to function. Starting in February 2025, the administration began imposing sanctions on ICC officials, freezing their assets and essentially making them international pariahs. The campaign escalated dramatically in August, when the U.S. sanctioned 4 additional ICC officials, including Canadian Judge Kimberly Prost. Prost's case is particularly telling. She was sanctioned specifically for ruling to authorize the ICC's investigation into U.S. personnel in Afghanistan. Not for any action related to Israel or Gaza, but for doing her job as an international judge investigating American war crimes. The targeting of a Canadian citizen for performing her judicial duties should have provoked outrage from Ottawa. Instead, there was deafening silence. This silence becomes even more troubling when you consider Canada's historic relationship with the ICC. Canada was instrumental in establishing the court, becoming the first country in the world to incorporate the obligations of the Rome Statute into its national laws in 2000. Canadian Philippe Kirsch served as the ICC's president from 2003 to 2009. The country had positioned itself as a champion of international justice and the rule of law. Yet when push came to shove, when a Canadian judge faced sanctions for upholding international law, the Carney government said virtually nothing. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand offered only tepid support, noting that she has utmost confidence in Prost and praising the court, but making no reference to the American sanctions against her. This wasn't an oversight. Canada had already missed two critical opportunities to defend the ICC. The first came in July 2025, when other states, civil society groups, and international organizations defended the court during its Assembly of States Parties meetings in New York. The second arose during the 59th meeting of the United Nations Human Rights Council in June 2025. In both cases, Canada chose to remain on the sidelines while its closest ally systematically dismantled an institution it had helped create. The contrast is striking and deeply troubling. Canada was willing to risk its trade relationship with the United States to recognize Palestinian statehood, a largely symbolic gesture that wouldn't immediately change anything on the ground. But it wasn't willing to defend the ICC, a functioning institution that could actually hold war criminals accountable when that institution came under direct attack. This selective courage reveals something important about how Canadian foreign policy operates under pressure. The recognition of Palestine, while significant, was part of a coordinated international effort that included major European allies. Canada wasn't going it alone, it was joining a coalition of like-minded countries taking similar steps. The defense of the ICC, by contrast, would have required Canada to directly confront the United States on an issue where America was isolated but determined. What explains this apparent contradiction? The answer lies in understanding the different types of pressure Canada faces and how it calculates its responses. Palestinian recognition, despite Trump's threats, was ultimately about future possibilities and symbolic gestures. The damage to U.S.-Canada relations would be real but manageable, especially if other major allies were taking similar steps. The ICC situation was different. Here, the United States was engaged in an active campaign to destroy an institution, using tools like sanctions that could have immediate, practical consequences for anyone who opposed them. Defending the ICC wouldn't just mean diplomatic disagreement. It could mean economic retaliation against Canadian officials, businesses, or institutions that interacted with the court. There's also the question of domestic political calculations. Palestinian recognition had broad international support and resonated with Canadian voters concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Defending the ICC, while legally and morally correct, was a more abstract issue that wouldn't generate the same public pressure for action. But this calculation reveals a troubling willingness to abandon principles when the cost becomes too high. The ICC represents everything Canada claims to stand for: multilateralism, international law, accountability for war crimes, and the rule of law. If Canada won't defend these institutions when they're under attack, what does its commitment to international justice really mean? The silence becomes even more problematic when you consider the precedent it sets. If the United States can successfully intimidate one of its closest allies into abandoning an international court, what message does that send to other countries? What happens to international law when even its strongest supporters are afraid to defend it? The Trump administration's strategy was working exactly as intended. By targeting individual officials with sanctions, by making the personal cost of supporting international justice too high to bear, America was effectively neutering institutions it couldn't directly control, and Canada's silence was enabling this strategy. The broader implications extend far beyond the ICC. Trump's willingness to use trade as a weapon to coerce allies on unrelated issues represents a fundamental shift in how America exercises power. Traditional diplomatic norms, which separated economic relationships from political disagreements, were being systematically dismantled. Countries were being forced to choose between their economic interests and their principles, and many, including Canada, were choosing economics. This wasn't just about Trump's personal style or his administration's particular policies. It represented a new model of international relations where economic leverage could be used to override legal obligations, moral principles, and institutional commitments. The most powerful country in the world was essentially telling its allies, conform to our preferences or pay the price. What made Canada's position particularly contradictory was the selective nature of its courage. The country was willing to take symbolic stands that generated headlines and satisfied domestic constituencies, but unwilling to defend the institutional foundations that made such stands meaningful. It was like applauding justice while allowing the courts to be destroyed. The consequences of this approach were already becoming apparent. Human rights organizations, legal experts, and civil society groups were beginning to question Canada's commitment to international justice. If Canada wouldn't defend its own judge when she faced sanctions for doing her job, could it be trusted to support international law when the stakes were even higher? The timing of these events also revealed the interconnected nature of international crises. The same American administration that was threatening Canada over Palestinian recognition was simultaneously destroying the institutions that could hold war criminals accountable. These weren't separate issues, they were part of a coordinated campaign to reshape international law and institutions according to American preferences. For Canada, this created an impossible situation. The country wanted to maintain its reputation as a principled actor on the international stage, but it also needed to manage its relationship with an increasingly unpredictable and aggressive neighbor. The result was a foreign policy marked by selective courage and strategic silence, principled when it was safe, quiet when it mattered most. This pattern extended beyond the ICC to other areas where Canada faced pressure from the United States. The country had been reluctant to criticize American human rights violations, slow to respond to U.S. attacks on multilateral institutions, and careful to avoid confrontations that might jeopardize economic relationships. The approach might have been pragmatic, but it was also corrosive to Canada's international credibility. How could a country that remained silent while its own judge was sanctioned for upholding international law claim to be a champion of justice? How could it lecture other countries about respecting international institutions while failing to defend those institutions when they came under attack? The situation also highlighted the broader crisis facing international law and institutions in the 21st century. The post-World War II order, built around multilateral institutions and legal frameworks, was under sustained assault from populist leaders and nationalist movements. The United States, which had been instrumental in creating this order, was now leading the charge to dismantle it. For smaller countries like Canada, this created existential challenges. Their influence in the world depended heavily on international institutions and legal frameworks that constrained the power of larger nations. When those institutions came under attack, countries like Canada faced a choice: defend the system that gave them influence, or accommodate the powers that were destroying it. Canada's response suggested a troubling willingness to choose accommodation over principle, at least when the costs of principled action became too high. This wasn't necessarily a conscious decision to abandon international law, but rather a series of calculated choices that, taken together, amounted to the same thing. The implications extended far beyond Canada's borders. Other middle power countries were watching closely to see how Canada navigated these pressures. If a country with Canada's resources, stability, and international reputation couldn't stand up to American pressure, what hope did smaller, more vulnerable nations have? The precedent being set was that even America's closest allies would ultimately bow to economic pressure when push came to shove. This was exactly the message that authoritarian leaders around the world wanted to hear. If international law could be ignored when it became inconvenient, if institutions could be attacked without consequence, if principles could be abandoned when the price became too high, then the entire framework of international cooperation was meaningless. The crisis also revealed the limitations of symbolic gestures in international relations. Palestinian recognition, while important, was ultimately a statement of intent rather than a concrete action that would immediately change conditions on the ground. The ICC, by contrast, was a functioning institution that could actually investigate war crimes and hold perpetrators accountable. Yet Canada was willing to risk American retaliation for the symbol while remaining silent about the substance. This pattern suggested a foreign policy more concerned with appearances than with results, more focused on managing domestic opinion than on defending international institutions. It was an approach that might work in the short term but would ultimately undermine Canada's credibility and influence. As the crisis deepened, the question facing Canada became increasingly stark. What did it really stand for? Was it a country committed to international law and justice? Or was it simply another middle power trying to navigate between competing pressures without taking real risks? The answer to that question would determine not just Canada's role in the world, but the future of the international order itself. Because if countries like Canada, democratic, stable, prosperous, and historically committed to multilateralism, wouldn't defend international institutions when they came under attack, then those institutions were probably doomed. And in a world without functioning international law and institutions, everyone would be less safe, less prosperous, and less free. The stakes couldn't be higher, and Canada's response would be remembered long after the immediate crisis had passed.